welcome to another episode of Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and as ever is with me Jessica Meyer, Chris Kempshall, and joining us today is Emma Hanna. Hello everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
So we're going to be discussing the British TV series Peaky Blinders. Emma, before we get to that, what's your background as a historian?
Well, I specialise in the cultural history of the two world wars, generally, cultural history and memory. And I wrote my first book on representations of the First World War on British television, the Great War on the small screen, and recently just have written about music in the British Armed Forces during the Great War. So I've also a project about the centenary of the First World War and how Britain has commemorated that period, but also the work of various engagement centres based in universities funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Heritage Lottery Fund. So Peaky Blinders has been on my radar for quite a few years. So I've been an avid watcher of it, but also I lived in Birmingham between the ages of 5 and 21. So, when I get tired or if I've had enough to drink, you will get the odd lilt of Brummie in my accent, I am told. So always round Peaky Blinders is a really interesting one for me.
Well, I wonder, before we go any further, for those people who are not familiar with it, what is the elevator pitch? What's the back of the fag packet synopsis for Peaky Blinders?
Well, it's described as a period crime drama, which was written by Stephen Knight, written and produced by Stephen Knight, who, interestingly, was also one of the people who developed Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which is a random fact. First broadcast, 12th of September 2013 on BBC Two, 4 series on BBC Two, before it moves to BBC One for Series 5. So it's really about gangs in Birmingham, and it sort of opens in 1919 on the streets of an area that I think we're supposed to, those who know Birmingham, sort of Sparkbrook, Small Heath area, very, very desirable student residences there now, I believe. So it's about gangs known as the Peaky Blinders. This gang particularly, which actually they were real people, and a lot of the people featured in the series are real historical figures. And the Peaky Blinders really got that moniker because they would all wear flat caps. The mythology tells us that had razor blades secreted within the peaks of their caps. So when they invariably got into their various fights and ruckuses, they could whip off their cap and slash the eyeballs of their opponents. So you didn't really want to get on the wrong side of them.
Health and safety nightmare.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that the dates are slightly wrong? Because wasn't the peak of the Peaky Blinders, if you'll excuse the pun, in the 1890s?
It certainly was, yeah. I mean, certainly the eminent Brummie historian Carl Chinn has written a book, actually, called Peaky Blinders, The Real Story, which outlines just that, Jessica, the great historian that you are. So certainly the 1850s to the 1890s is really the peak of the Peaky Blinders and sort of Birmingham gang warfare, which sort of came out, the Peaky Blinders being one of a group of people called the slogging gangs from 1872. Sort of Chinn talks about this, the slogging gangs who sort of banded about Birmingham after sort of a middle-class crackdown on rough sports and gambling, and they used to fight the police a lot as well as each other. And so for the 1890s, really the sloggers became known as the Peaky Blinders. But really, Chinn's research, he did his doctoral thesis in 1986, in which he talks about a number of his family members were actually Peaky Blinders. They were sort of over by 1914. And Chinn said a lot of them returned better men, which is not what the TV series is about. Certainly it starts in 1919 with a lot of the gang members, not just the Peaky Blinders, but their adversaries as well, having served abroad, which gives it a wonderful backdrop. So yes, that's pretty much one of the main, I think, areas of historical diversion, shall we say.
Was it really 2013 that it was first aired? That seems like a very long time ago. I mean, I know everything before January seems a very, very long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, apparently Stephen Knight wrote it a good 10 years before that and pitched it to Channel 4. But they didn't go for it. 2013. And the last Series 5, the last one was 2019. Apparently there are 2 more series. They've not been given the green light for production, but Stephen Knight has been quoted in the press saying that really if he wants to take it all the way up to, and I quote, when the first air raid siren in Birmingham goes off in 1940. So that he says it would take another 2 series in total. But, with 2 BAFTAs and an average audience of around 5 million for the last series, I think he's probably COVID pending. He's probably on to a good one.
Are the cast ageing quickly enough to convincingly go from 1919 to 1940? I mean, Cillian Murphy's a good-looking chap anyway, but I'm struggling to pitch him 20 years into the future.
Curiously, Cillian Murphy's actually 20 years older than I thought he was to start with.
Oh, God, how old is he?
Well, it's just mainly because I've forgotten that he was in 28 Days Later, and that's actually a very old film now. It's a 20-year-old film, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that was another uplifting one.
So he's probably still under his theoretical age. He's older than his theoretical age in Peaky Blinders.
Yeah, unless they go down the route of The Crown, which I don't think they can do with this one. I think they can age. They can age. Depends what substance they've got Tommy Shelby on next, really, doesn't it? He's done opium, he's done cocaine, he's done drink.
The haircuts and the facial hair. Arthur Shelby's moustache seems to age him quite nicely, must be said.
So why do we think they changed the backdrop from before the First World War, which is, more historically correct, to after the First World War? Why does Stephen Knight think that seemingly is more appropriate? Do we know? Or what's it adding to the series?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think there are 2 things going on here, and there's a very interesting chapter written by a guy called Paul Long about sort of space and place and class in Peaky Blinders. And I think really Stephen Knight has done for Birmingham what Alan Bleasdale did for Liverpool and Paul Abbott did for Manchester. I think Stephen Knight's sort of doing that for Birmingham in that, he's one of many people who believe that the Midlands are a gaping black hole in cultural outputs, really. The glory days of Pebble Mill are over. Firstly, I think he sees really, to set it in Birmingham, which is, was supposed to be the workshop of the world, very underrepresented, its sort of negative image of its sort of industrial heritage. So he's sort of rebranding it almost with Peaky Blinders, but also putting it in an era which, again, some people have said is a the 1920s, 1930s, it's often been glossed over, or particularly the 1920s. That area from 1919 and then up to the general strike has not been as well represented as it might have been. Downton Abbey definitely doesn't count. Is right the other end of the spectrum, and I think that showing of class, gender and race and the various things that get explored in Peaky Blinders through the 20s, you get a much more granular vision of, that whole way of, what Raymond Williams called that whole way of life, and that really a sense of a history from below in a time of great tumult.
Does the war act as sort of a shortcut to the violence that is such a big part of the program, do you think? Because I'm not sure. My suspicion is that when people think of the immediate post-war period, it's easier for them to think of men being brutally violent because they've just come back from a war than it does, say, in the middle of High Victoriana of 1870, 1880. Even though historically, clearly that is not the case. So do you think the war acts in that way as sort of a quick way of saying these men are brutalised?
Absolutely, and there's so many quotes you can get across there, but certainly there's that, the conflict being constantly in the background, this overbearing presence, this sort of structuring device. You know, one historian said it inflects the grain of its psychic landscape. You know, the war inflects the grain of its psychic landscape, I think is a wonderful quote to say that. And so many bits of the script, you know, are always harking back to this idea of these men being completely brutalised, and also that creating that class of that test of masculinity. Even one of the youngest but one Shelby brother, they all served apart from the very youngest. And those that served in France are very much regard themselves as set apart from those that didn't. There's one time when they're trying to recruit new members or give instructions to their existing ones, Tommy Shelby says they didn't fight, so they're different. They stayed kids. And, you know, another one saying that he was completely up to a mission because he killed 100 men and saw 1,000 more die. So it's, you know, what have you done? You know, you didn't go. And certainly for both genders is interesting as well, this idea of Polly, of Tommy Shelby's aunt, who is one of the higher-ups in their business. You know, she says to him at one point, damn them for what they did to you in France. But also in the next breath pointing out that while you lot were away fighting, it was the women at home that were managing everything. That comes through quite strongly, not as strongly as it might have done, but it's very much, and there's some very strong female characters in Peaky Blinders who really underline that they weren't just sitting at home keeping the home fires burning. They were doing a lot of the burning themselves, probably. Burning things down. But yes, this sense of brutalisation is very much, and certainly Tom Cardy's character, Alfie Solomons, who he's an absolute psychopath, and he talks about performing his own crucifixion in the trenches, and about how amazing it was, in no uncertain terms. There is this sense with these men that all bets are off, and certainly, you know, Tommy Shelby points out that he actually he's gone past the point of being afraid of death because he expected it almost daily, and they're almost surprised that they're home. You know? And a lot of them seem actually quite, you know, there is a lot of mental torment in Peaky Blinders with the returning veterans as well. It's almost like they don't want to be home. They, at one point, I think it's series 1, you know, Tommy Shelby's talking to someone who actually took a bullet for him. And the guy's saying, I wish I hadn't taken that bullet for you, Tommy. And then Tommy agrees with him. He said, no, I wish you hadn't either. He actually would rather be dead. I think, again, that survivor guilt comes through. But brutalisation is definitely something, yeah.
It's a very kind of interesting choice of war service that they have, isn't it? Because most of them sappers seem to be during the war, which is an interesting shift from kind of being general infantry or so, because doesn't the season open with Cillian Murphy's character having a kind of a very claustrophobic flashback to Germans about to break through a tunnel or something like that, and it's a really nightmarish image.
All the way through series 1, pretty much, he has a number of flashbacks of often fueled when he's having one of his opium binges late at night, and he starts to hear and to see breaking through a tunnel. You know, he's back in France, probably somewhere underneath Hill 60, you know, tunnelling through, and, you know, that hand-to-hand fighting with Germans in trenches, and that horrible, that claustrophobia, as you say, is ever present.
I think that's a nod, though. I was just desperately trying to look it up, to one of the stories of the original Peaky Blinders historical characters who was buried during the First World War and dug out and saved. And my Google foo has suddenly failed me to dig up where I read that. But I think that's possibly where he gets a nod from, and perhaps it's expanded upon from that. But it is a peculiar one to pull out otherwise, unless he's an avid birdsong fanatic.
It could be that. You could disappear down the metaphorical rabbit hole, couldn't you? Really, of that sort of that drawing comparisons between, you know, this idea of his claustrophobia with his life, and trying to break out into respectability to get his rather underhand and frankly illegal business activities onto a more legal, respectable footing. Because the Shelbys are very interesting. They're half Romany, and obviously very working class. So they're not accepted or respected by anybody in particular. Only those that people are frightened of them. People above them in class shun them. A lot of the working class and lower class people don't want to have too much to do with them because of their gypsy origins. But again, that's another interesting factor about language. They didn't hire any linguists apparently, so the Romany is not correct apparently. But yeah, sorry, back to the tunnel. Yeah, I think it's an interesting metaphor about being trapped and of panic and of having to fight your way. I think all cultural historians are in a danger to gazing through their navel so far they come out the other side, aren't they? This could be one of those things, really, that sense of scrabbling and of trying to escape and trying to break through and having to fight. But I could be reading too much into that.
I mean, it is a series that rather lends itself to that, because you mentioned birdsong, Angus, and I've actually written a blog post on that episode and war poetry, and speculated wildly about whether Steve Knight read Alan Seeger's I Have a Rendezvous with Death before filming. There's a dream sequence where Tommy Shelby is imagining I can never remember the name of the love interest in season 1.
Grace.
So it's tying, Grace. So it's tying his flashbacks to his war service into his romantic feelings for Grace, and Alan Seeger's I Have a Rendezvous with Death does something very similar with sex and violence. So, yes, as Emma, you say, in danger of staring at my navel far too hard, I made these odd connections. But it's very much a series that lends itself to that, to sort of tying in with our cultural references to the First World War, as well as to its own interpretation of the war.
His rank is interesting, isn't it, as well? Because he was a sergeant, I believe, when he left, Tommy Shelby.
I think it was Sergeant Major.
I'm not sure if he wasn't Sergeant Major or a colour sergeant or something like that. So he's a very senior NCO.
He did. He worked his way. I mean, you really see that, but it's sort of coming back. He's the ultimate officer of his men at home, and the way they still retain that sense of rank, of always looking to him, but also that sense of the battalion structure almost, and that so many wartime phrases come on, they're on parade, or, they're talking about being on the same side, even the gangs that they used to fall out with and fight with before the war, actually a lot of them served in the same, in the Warwickshires, apparently during the war, and they see them say, the Black Country Boys, the Peaky Blinders are back together fighting on the same side again. But retaining that sort of rank structure and battalion unit identity comes through all the time in Peaky Blinders. It's very much a recurring thing.
I think at one point in the second season they muse on their kind of their war service and their kind of big moments, and I think at some point they mentioned that they fought at both the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun, which suggests it must have been a hell of a tunnel that they dug.
That really slips up for us First World War aficionados, though, doesn't it? I mean,
but then I wonder whether or not they decided that kind of the feeling of nightmarishness was worth the inaccuracy, the kind of being at monumental key moments, whether they were British or not, was actually worth, because the First World War fans in the audience are going to go, that's not right, and no one else is going to care. But they might think, I've heard of that. It was a big moment. Their war service must have been difficult.
It's the Somme often comes up. I mean, obviously it's the big British one, isn't it? The Somme is, the byword for, the ultimate futility of British involvement in the Great War, for better or for worse. It's that hook from which to hang everything else. I mean, they don't even bother mentioning Passchendaele, or I think the Hindenburg line gets a mention once, maybe, but I might be imagining that. So again, to pick the Somme and Verdun is the biggest efforts. Which one do we go with?
It's interesting how many of the usual tropes sort of seem to be present as shell-shock, mental trauma, mud and blood kind of thing. But I wondered if, I might be wrong, but is there an absence of the talk about futility of the First World War in the series? Now, it was just when I was thinking about this, I couldn't picture back any particular great criticism of the futility of it all.
No.
And it's sort of offset by patriotism. they're extremely patriotic.
Yeah, well, certainly you don't get a huge amount of futility. You get the sense, or I get the sense, watching it and looking at various references, is that it was a job. It was paid work and it was a job. It was something that you did because everyone else was doing it, and it was something. There's an element there of proving yourself a man, of there not being that many opportunities at home anyway, so you might as well go. And it was a job to do. And it was sort of the ultimate big fight that they could get involved with. But certainly when there's one mention of their war medals, and they're talking about, well, they just threw them in the canal. They said I threw mine in the cut. They're not particularly proud of that, but they're more proud of everyone knowing that they went and they served, and that they have this extra level of hardness about them, even though they're actually incredibly damaged on the inside.
There are two things that occur to me on the back of that. One is the extent to which that changes over time, over the course of the series, because I do get the impression that by the final series so far, if we've got two more to come, that relationship with Oswald Mosley that Tommy Shelby has, that complicated relationship, and with Churchill, is in part about, very much building on the historical reality of Mosley trying to mobilise war service for a political cause, and Tommy Shelby's buying into that in a way that possibly he wouldn't have done in season one. My other observation on the back of that is, going back to that point about class, is this is a very different interpretation of the war from the one that I think we're used to seeing, the sort of junior officer interpretation of the war, the futility literature, all of it by junior officers. And I'm just wondering, how much do you think this is a new way of representing the war in British popular culture, one that is perhaps more working class, or is this not particularly representative of a working class view and just a particular interpretation of the war?
I think it's certainly a very interesting working class interpretation of the war, as you rightly point out. There are no tragic officers writing poetry and sobbing in the corner, are there? And you would have to wonder what Tommy Shelby would have done with one anyway. There's no room for that. Well, one can only imagine. I think it's that overview of futility and also of tragedy, isn't it? The poetry is all about the tragedy and the futility. But for the Peaky Blinders, it's tragedy of a different kind, injuries of a different kind. It's sort of the war is still ever present in the background, really, talking to explain why these men are even harder than they probably were before the war. Also, this sense of all bets are off. It was almost the ruling class have either proved themselves unworthy of their roles, or, like the widow's husband, didn't come back. Is that series 3 when Tommy Shelby is with May Carlton, the horse trainer? When he enters that other sort of rarefied world of the big country house and professional horse owners, it's very. It sort of seems to him that maybe that was the past world, and that the new world that they've come back to is the one they need to fight for the most.
It's interesting. You keep using the word hard, or these men hardening and proving their manhood, but you do have some really interesting depictions of mental trauma and shell shock, which we tend to interpret as being the inverse.
Oh, you mean post-traumatic stress disorder?
Thanks, Chris.
Brittle, I think, maybe. Brittle would be good. Yeah, I don't keep using the word hard, but sort of brittle, certainly. I mean, you've got absolute out and out portrayals of what they would have been calling shell shock. I mean, the character of Danny Whizbang very early on, he's got a broom shooting imaginary Germans. And rushes into the pub really, really very early on, rushing into the pub saying, because he believes he's a bomb about to go off. That's why he's called Danny Whizbang, because he's that traumatized, and he rushes into the pub and says he's going to explode, and Tommy Shelby literally has to jump on him and calm him down and tell himself to pull yourself together. You're not in France, you're here. And Danny Whizbang says, I left my brains in the mud. I left myself over there. I left my brains over there. and obviously he's incredibly damaged, but they all are. With Tommy Shelby having his tunnelling nightmares at night, but also his brother Arthur, who again an utter psychopath, absolute psychopath. Arthur, who's trying to kill himself twice, is absolute, even by Peaky Blinders standards, is a chronic abuser of drugs and alcohol. It's always there, isn't it? It's constant. Prolonged explanation of why these men are as brutal as they are, brutalised.
I absolutely agree. I think there tends to be an interpretation of psychological trauma as somehow making these men more understandable, more sympathetic. In a lot of the depictions of shell shock are, they're not. War hasn't changed them because they can still feel, they can still be traumatized by it. And this is depicting the other aspect, if you will, of psychological trauma of war, which is that it makes men more violent. And I think that, certainly if you look at the research done by combat stress into contemporary experiences of psychological trauma, of warfare, a lot of men, that is their reaction. It's not to sit sobbing quietly in a corner writing poetry. It is usually to attack their members of their family, not because they intend to, but because that is what their traumatized minds tell them to do. It says something about our rather complicated relationship with war trauma as something that makes men sympathetic, that I've always found fascinating about the series, I have to say.
That aspect of the trauma making them more violent, that feels like an unusual portrayal in British media, because as you said, the normality is, oh look, he served in the war, you can tell that he did because he's a puddle in the corner, writing endless poetry and sobbing. But that brutalization, that anger, the violence feels like an unusual portrayal of shell shock in kind of British media depictions of the post-war period.
I think it's certainly it's unusual, but I think it's so much more vivid and realistic, isn't it? This is a very granular portrayal of probably what it was actually like about men coming back and people not knowing what to do with them, not knowing what to do with themselves. Of some of them all being frustrated that they've come back, and being angry, and that sense of they've literally been to hell and back and seen all sorts of things along the way, and what's the point anymore? There were no rules really. Although you get that interesting dichotomy, I think, particularly with Tom, the Shelbys sort of running their army of, the gangs are almost run like armies. They've got their NCOs and they're sort of ruling class, and they've got their other ranks. And a lot of them are talking about keeping order and being organised. Organised crime in its most literal sense, but there is sense of honour. There is a code as well. The sense of the gangs each having their own territories, and this great racing course war of 1921. It did actually happen apparently, and a lot of the characters, Billy Kimber, Alfie Solomon, Darby Sabin, and the Changretta family were all real gangs and gang members at this time. And there's this sense of order and a code against, but life doesn't actually mean much anymore because they've seen so much of life die horribly, either at their own hands or other people. So I probably lost my thread a little bit there.
I'm just wondering about the ambiguity that points up. As you say, it probably, the violence of the psychological reaction probably does reflect a reality for many men coming back, much more than some of our more traditional images of what shell shock might have been like. But by linking it to criminal gangs, I'm wondering about the sort of removal from the reality for most men that this is something that then becomes associated with crime, with the underworld, rather than with more general British society at this time. And then on top of that, you've got what is an intensely glamorized depiction of crime, with the very sharp haircuts and the beautiful clothes and, the sort of period elegance that manages to attach itself to the program. So I'm wondering a little bit about that ambiguity there.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the stylisation is interesting, isn't it? All to a wonderful Nick Cave soundtrack.
Well, there's something bizarre about the soundtrack, because my wife kept pointing out that there is a lot of contemporary music in there, just rescored and rearranged to be, oldie-worldy, as it were.
Yeah. Leonard Cohen as well. Leonard Cohen wrote for it. Apparently David...
Talking Heads.
Yeah. David Bowie was a massive fan and was certainly planning to do some stuff. I mean, really, it's been compared to the American series Boardwalk Empire. It really has that crossing. But, to go back to Jessica's point about the stylisation versus the brutality, I mean, it's sort of, the parallels with Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, isn't it? That kind of Snatch, that sort of thing. It's not too much of a hop, skip and a jump from, what Guy Ritchie might have done with this kind of thing.
With regards to Boardwalk Empire, because I suspect at some point in the future we'll probably end up doing an episode on Boardwalk Empire in general. But how do we think Peaky Blinders kind of compares because as you said, I mean, Boardwalk Empire comes first. There's definite comparisons between the two of kind of post-First World War, organised crime, gang-based violence using historical figures generally. But my feeling of Peaky Blinders was, I mean, again, it might just be because I'm more familiar with British culture, but something slightly more kind of intrinsically violently working class about it than the ostentatious glamour of Boardwalk Empire. But then you watch bits and pieces of Peaky Blinders and they're all in 1920s ball gowns and stuff like that, so that aspect is definitely in there. But there does seem to be something a little different about Boardwalk Empire's portrayal of organised crime than the slightly more kind of Al Capone-esque mafia Boardwalk Empire nature.
There's a modernity to Boardwalk Empire that perhaps isn't there in Peaky Blinders.
That could be it.
And as ridiculous as this may sound, when the American gangsters walk in what is season 4, it's quite striking that they've got, Thompson submachine guns, a modern. What does Tommy Shelby pull out? His Lewis gun, which somehow seems archaic, thudding away to the Thompson, this ultra modern lightweight machine gun shooting back.
I also wonder if we know more about weirdly interwar gang violence in America because of cinema and because of prohibition and because of Al Capone and that therefore we feel more familiar with that particular world, whereas interwar crime in Birmingham, it's not something that I'm particularly familiar of, or interwar life in Birmingham for that matter. It's not it hasn't been pre-glamorized.
I think there's a lot of this about this though. It's Stephen Knight almost. I don't think the word glamorization would be one that he would agree with, but I mean, certainly reading up on Stephen Knight, he grew up in the Small Heath area, and he I think Peaky Blinders is really an ode to the repertoire of local myths and mythology that sort of grew up around there, and he does he has spoken about this sort of using Peaky Blinders rooted on sort of oral histories and memories of what used to go on in some of these areas. And it may be just to throw in there, a lot of Small Heath, Sparkbrook area from the 1950s onwards particularly became one of the areas with very concentrated immigration. I mean, so you could, again, to what extent are we pulling this too far? This could be almost an ode to a time where, the Peaky Blinders period, the 1920s, was that time where Britain was British. Or, even though there's a lot of different races, quite correctly, a lot of the Chinese element of the laundries and the brothels and the opium sellers, that's all very, very rightly comes in there. And obviously there still is a very vibrant Chinatown in Birmingham today. And also you've got a mix of some Caribbean characters in there, including the Jamaican poet Benjamin Zephaniah is crops up a lot of the time in there. But again, this idea of sort of paying tribute really think tribute be, again, not quite the right word, along with glamour, that Stephen Knight is sort of paying some sort of homage to the working class men and women that experienced, 1919 onwards, and all of the different changes and challenges and outright poverty and awfulness that was their life. And this sort of is the ultimate sort of dramatic televised history from below in a sort of very sort of Thompsonian fashion. Is that real antidote to Downton Abbey? I think maybe that I would try and approach, your point, Jessica, about the stylisation versus the absolute awfulness of the deeds and some of the way that they live their lives and treat other people. This sort of these working class credentials that Knight has in Birmingham. It's almost his ode to that.
It definitely has a really strong sense of place. When I think about having watched it a while ago, I watched it when it originally came out, and the scenes that are most memorable are the ones, in some ways, the exteriors, a lot of them on the canals, or then later in the countryside. There's a really strong sense of place in Peaky Blinders, which isn't very common with interwar detective television programs, actually. And I think almost more than some of the modern stylization, maybe what makes it unique and feel really rooted, as you say, in that identity that Stephen Knight was bringing to it. Certainly the accents don't do it.
Yeah, the accents wander all over the place as actors forget where they're supposed to be geographically in the country.
Yeah, well, it was filmed in a number of different places, apparently. It had a lot of funding from an arts company in Yorkshire. So they and on the basis that they had to film quite a bit of it in Yorkshire for the funding. But it was also filmed in Liverpool, and bits of it were in Birmingham, but a lot of it was filmed at the Black Country Museum in Dudley, which, as someone who grew up in Birmingham, obviously every 2 years it was the law that you had to go on your school trip to the Black Country Museum. So, I have great memories of being, on the canal. We have, done the bit of going through the tunnel on your back, going through the canal. So it is all, I think the attention to detail is there. Anyone who's not been to the Black Country Museum must do so.
When did you decide that actually Peaky Blinders might be something that wasn't just you were going to watch on and enjoy on TV, that you might actually do something with it? Was it a kind of a case of, sitting down and watching it at some point and thinking, actually, I could do X, Y, and Z with this? Or did it just kind of slowly grow on you?
I started watching it as a normal punter, as a normal viewer. And then I was just struck, and as a sort of ex-Brummie as well, and I was just sort of struck by the presence of the war. And I think, it's this terrible affliction of being funded by the government to be writing on this sort of thing. And, obviously with it being broadcast over the centenary, which I don't think was deliberate, I do think it's an accident. I mean, because Knight wrote this 10 years before the centenary and was pitching it in other places. I sort of looked at it, particularly when I was asked to contribute to the Edinburgh Companion to the First World War and the Arts. I was asked to write the chapter on television drama. And also, I just wanted to look at the different categories of programme. And to be honest, you just got sick of doing Birdsong and Journey's End, really. And sort of Peaky Blinders, it was just such, it's quite a palate cleanser in many ways for some of the reason that we were talking about. In that, it's not the tragic junior officers. It's not mud, blood and poetry. It's got lots of mud and blood, but very little poetry. I was just fascinated by the war as an ever-present character, which was explaining the reasons for these, the actions of these men. And that's what really attracted me to it. And again, the stylized elements was just so different from what we've seen before. Yeah, we all had to do an awful lot of writing about stuff over the centenary, and we all had to feel like we were engaging with something, and not a week would go by, as I'm sure you have too, that something cannot go on television or be in the newspaper about the First World War without someone asking you if you've seen it, or someone sending you clippings from a paper. So, and again, it's just like, well, if I don't do it, someone else is going to do it. And it just seemed like just a really interesting thing to bring into the conversation about the war not being the forefront of the programme, but the war being that background explanation to why these people were acting the way they were, and about the interactions with others were very influenced by their wartime experiences as well. It was just so different to what we normally have to look at. So it was refreshing.
Do you think that's going to continue to be the case as it moves towards the Second World War? My own sense of the later series is that actually, as it's become less engaged with the First World War as an explanation for this behaviour, as the war moves in time, it's perhaps capturing my interest less. Is that just me speaking as a First World War historian, or is that a problem with the development of the programme, do you think?
I don't know. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think, those of us that are still hedging our bets, who sort of still normally do look at the modern memory of the Second World War as well. As the gravy train has rolled out of the station of the centenary of the Great War, this money forest that the present government have found to pay for all this COVID-19 business, if there is anything left over, and the funding will go towards eventually the Second World War. So I think we may see a migration of people. Again, we're all under pressure to write funding bids, to bring in research money to our institutions, and to remain, certainly those of us that care about how history is done in public and elements of public history, we are all going to see a shift towards the Second World War. And I'm very interested in, and I've written a bit about how some elements of First World War music and culture are brought back again in the Second World War. And again, this element of, we were there in 1914-18, so we are therefore more experienced and more authorised to talk about war than you are. I mean, it'd be interesting, isn't it? I mean, what characters is Stephen Knight going to bring in? I mean, we've had Churchill. Oswald Mosley. Is it going to be that Tommy Shelby has a little trip to Germany in 1933 and has tea with Adolf? We don't know. Quite possibly, was Adolf Hitler into racehorsing? The Nazis must have been. And probably, Edward and Wallace Simpson will be there too. Who knows?
Sounds like a hell of a picnic.
Who knows what's going to happen? What role are the Peaky Blinders going to play in appeasement? Is Tommy Shelby going to get involved in Spitfire production?
Well, isn't Chamberlain a Birmingham boy?
He is. Oh yes, Chamberlain's very big.
There's your connection.
He's got to be.
He was mayor of. In fact, Chamberlain was mayor of Birmingham, wasn't he, during the First War?
Yeah, Chamberlain, big Birmingham dynasty, the Chamberlains, the statues all over the place to him. It'd be interesting, wouldn't it? I mean, I think, again, it's interesting the role of real historical figures. And in Peaky Blinders, there are loads. Jessie Eden, the Labour activist, the workers' rights activist, she was real. That is interesting. But I think my least favourite bit of Peaky Blinders were the Winston Churchill bits. That just went into completely ridiculous territory for me. I mean, let alone old, the Ulster accent as well. I mean, that was appalling. But the whole Winston Churchill storyline was probably, if I could give Peaky Blinders an edit, that would be the one I would try and get rid of.
As I say, it has a lot to do with patriotism rather than necessary futility. Is how of how they view it, especially when they're sort of slotting in Churchill, the most patriotic man apparently you can imagine in the country, who saw us through the last war and all the connotations that he brings, by sort of slotting him in. Yeah, I mean, what I'd have liked to have seen was Tommy Shelby going, right, Mr. Churchill, explain the Dardanelles then.
So what I can just to as a roundabout, response to Jessica's question about, as it moves towards the Second World War, is it going to get less interesting? Maybe not, but I think some of us might be watching between our fingers that which historical characters come up next.
I'm just imagining a version of Chamberlain stood there. I have in my hand a letter signed by Herr Hitler, and in my other hand a hat filled with razor blades, which I used to blind Herr Hitler. And then we're off into counterfactual and away and over the hills.
So as we slip into counterfactuals, do you think we should probably leave it there? So, Jessica, what we talk about next time? I think we thought we'd make this a trilogy, which we didn't set off to do.
No, we didn't. So we're still talking about television crime dramas, back to detective dramas, and we're moving countries again. We're going to Australia. We're going to talk about Miss Fisher's murder mysteries, a little bit of gender, but I really want to talk about the medical history of the war in Miss Fisher's murder mysteries, which has been obsessing me for the last few months. So I'm very excited about that. It's set in 1929 in Melbourne. There's 3 series, 2 of 13 episodes, 1 of 8 episodes. If you don't have a lot of time, focus on the episode called Death Comes Knocking, because that's the one I'll probably be talking about most. There are also 20 books featuring Phryne Fisher. I will again talk about a couple of those books, probably, but mainly about the television series. So there's your homework.
As we're all going to be watching Mrs. Fisher's Murder Mysteries, which I think we've watched the first episode of. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, Emma. It was good fun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emma.
Oh, it's a lovely war. Oh, we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Come fast, Richard, how can we spend the Olivia? Oh, it's a lovely war.